Okay, so in part one, we talked about the Triptych temples and how they were built by the pyramid cultures. And we saw how the same 3-in-1 door triptych was later inherited by secret societies like the Skull and Bones, Shriners, Masonic fraternity, and the Knights of Pythias. I explained my theory that the Triptych temples encode what we talk about in Latin as the coincidentia oppositorum, which is the balance of opposites, and how this was what I believe, what I call a universal religion in antiquity. So we saw how medieval operative cathedrals built by the Freemasons encode this 3-in-1 door triptych entrance. And finally, I talked about how the Gothic architecture surrounding the triptych in these cathedrals symbolizes the very same balance of opposites teaching that we see in the ancient cultures, thus revealing the meaning of the triptych. The architecture around the cathedrals reveals the same balance of opposites as the ancient triptych temples. So it's very clear to me, and the way I explain it in the book, that the Freemasons really understood the ancient meaning of the triptych, and not just in one ancient civilization, but in Asia, in Africa, and in the Americas, as we talked about yesterday. So today I want to start by pointing out some of the more esoteric triptych architecture that's hidden in famous artwork. And here's an example. Take a close look at the triptych 3-in-1 window behind Jesus in the famous Last Supper painting. Notice how it matches up with the image on the bottom. The image on the bottom shows a window from a Masonic temple. And as you can see, the triptych is the common denominator here. I found that fascinating because it shows a connection, really. And it shows how the triptych is at the center of this connection. Now, with 6 apostles on one side and 6 apostles on the other side of Christ, it's clear that Da Vinci really wanted to convey the idea of a balance, you know, and again, you have the balance of opposites, 6 on one side and 6 on the other. And the message here is, when you balance the twin sides, you find the center. And again, from yesterday, we talked about how the center was the GodSelf, the inner spiritual soul self, the higher self. And that is a God, according to esoteric philosophy, Freemasonry, Hermeticism, and so on. This inner divinity, as we call it, is depicted by the Christ figure. And notice how he's aligned with the center door. Christ is aligned with the center door. In esoteric Christianity, this so-called Christ principle stands for the inner soul, the inner God. It's the eternal and divine part of us that was never born and never dies. The 20th century scholars like Gerald Massey and Alvin Boyd Kuhn discussed this idea of the Christ principle in their books, lectures, and research papers. They showed how Christianity is really based on a corruption of the pagan teachings regarding this idea. For the pagans, the Christ did not refer to one man. There was not one Christ over there. It denoted the inner soul or the inner God that we all have within us. And that's a very important teaching. Here we have a quote from Massey. Christ was the immortal spirit in man. It did not and could not depend on any single manifestation in one historic personality. Historic Christianity originated with turning the teachings inside out and externalizing the mythical allegory in a personal human history, a huge and hideous mistake. More recently, in his 2005 book, The Pagan Christ, Rhodes scholar Tom Harper resurrected Massey's teachings, and he said, the Christ principle is potentially in every one of us. Christ of the myth became a flesh and blood person identified with Jesus. And again, he points out how that's a mistake as well. And of course, we have Joseph Campbell, who in the late 19th and the 20th century talked about how we are all manifestations of Buddha consciousness or Christ consciousness, only we don't know it. The word Buddha means the one who waked up. We are all to do that. We're all to wake up to the Christ or Buddha consciousness within us. And as early as the 1800s, this is fascinating to me, the Freemasons knew all this, even before a lot of the modern scholars like Joseph Campbell. Here's a quote from a book in 1896 by a Freemason named J.D. Buck. Listen to what he says. When this perfection is realized, the state is called Christos with the Greeks and Buddha with the Hindus. It'll be urged by modern theologians that this view dethrones Christ. To this objection, the answer is that any other view orphans humanity. It's far more important that men should strive to become Christs than that they should believe that Jesus was Christ. If the Christ state can be attained by but one human during the whole evolution of the race, then the evolution of man is a farce and human perfection an impossibility. And here's my favorite part. Jesus is no less divine because all men may reach the same divine perfection. And we're at a conference called Megalithomania, and in my opinion, all the megalithic architecture in the ancient world is based on this information. I believe it's something that has to do with the power that we have within us to manifest this Christ state, this higher power within us, and the understanding of the way the sun and the moon work, and the way the sun and the moon have a pull on us because we're all a part of the same universe, and how it all affects the ideas here being described. Finding the center between opposites, and again in the megalithic ruins, the opposites being the sun and the moon, finding the center is tantamount to finding the inner Christ. And this is the message of the Last Supper. It's also the message encoded in the triptych that we find esoterically encoded in the so-called Calvary scene, or the Golgotha scene of the crucifixion of Christ. 3 crosses, right? And Christ's cross is in the middle. And it's flanked by 2 opposing crosses. Now, how do we know these are opposites? These crosses on either side of Christ are opposing crosses. We know this from Scripture because if you remember, there are 2 thieves who were crucified on both sides of Christ. There was the penitent thief on the right, the one who realized he had sinned, and then the impenitent thief on the left, the one who was not remorseful. Those are opposites. These thieves, in fact, represent the yin and the yang, the male and the female, the left and the right, the penitent and the impenitent. It's the pairs of opposites that we've been discussing. Christ in the middle forms the balance point, the center point between the 2 opposites, between the 2 extremes. Many Renaissance artists knew about this, and one of them was an Italian painter named Andrea Mantegna. Excuse me. Basically what he did was he painted one cross in the light, and he painted the other cross in the dark. One that he painted in the light is on the right side of Christ. That's the penitent thief, and the one in the dark he painted as the impenitent thief. Again, the coincidentia oppositorum, the balance of the opposites. Excuse me. So, as we can see by this side-by-side comparison, the triptych that Da Vinci used is actually rooted in ancient Egypt. Notice the similarity in architecture here. The Egyptians were prolific builders of ancient triptych temples. Here we see one image from Trajan's kiosk in Philae. And we can see that crowning the center door of the triptych temple is a symbol called the Otton. It's the sun disk of Egypt. Now, the Otton crowns the center door of all of Egypt's triptych temples, and it later became the rose window of Gothic cathedrals. And we talked about that in yesterday's lecture, how there's a rose window above the center door of all the Gothic cathedrals. And you could see the parallel here. See the 3 doors of the triptych with a rose window atop the center door, and the same thing here. 3 doors of a triptych, and you have a circular symbol above the center door. In Egypt, the rose window is circular. The Otton is circular, just like in the rose windows of Gothic cathedrals. This is the Hathor Temple at Dendera, and it too is a triptych temple with the Otton symbol above the center door. This is another triptych temple in Egypt from Aswan, and again, note the triptych or sun disk. The Otton or sun disk crowning the center door. Here is another triptych from Egypt. This is from the Temple of Seti II in Karnak. And again, it's a perfect triptych temple. You can't see it, but there's an Otton or sun disk crowning the center door. So in every one of Egypt's triptych temples, the primary significance is given to the center door. And in every single case, there's always the Otton symbol above the center door. Now, why the Otton? Okay, what exactly does the Otton symbolize? So just like in the rose windows of Gothic cathedrals, the Otton is a circle with a dot in the center, and when it's written in Egyptian hieroglyphics. Now, for the Egyptians, the Otton symbolized both the third eye and the inner soul or source that the awakened third eye sees. And you can see that here in this imagery. Now remember how we talked about yesterday how the rose window is actually a symbol of the self, and it's also a symbol of the third eye. The third eye awakens and sees the inner self. It doesn't no longer see the yang side of things or the yin side of things. It's now balanced in the center. It can awaken its third eye, and the third eye looks inward. The eye is a center with a point in the middle because that's the shape of the soul. And we know this because the Otton appears on the forehead in Egyptian artifacts, and we can see that here. These Egyptian images depict what in ancient Hinduism is called the Agena chakra, the third eye chakra. So the Otton was depicted as a third eye between the two eyes. It's the same exact thing that we see in India. You show this to an Egyptologist and he will just laugh at you. And I know that because I've done that and they've laughed. The Otton stands for the awakened third eye that sees the soul within, which soul we all have. It's the divine spark within us. The Otton is thus a symbol of both the third eye and the inner soul. So I explain a lot of this in my book, Written in Stone. I also explain it in my other book, The Missing Link. The circle has no beginning and no end, and therefore it symbolizes eternity. We talked about that yesterday. Now look at the twin serpents that are issuing from the Otton symbol. Of course, the Otton has wings, and we know that anything with wings is heavenly. It's higher because it's able to fly high. Anytime you have something with wings, you know it's something higher, spiritual, eternal, divine. So, but if you look at the two serpents, what exactly do the two serpents stand for? And they stand for yin and yang, and left and right, and good and evil, and all the pairs of opposites. Now, how do we know they symbolize this duality, this pairs of opposites teaching? Well, first of all, they're of equal size and parallel shape, and that's important. Second, the serpents are facing opposite directions, signifying their corresponding yet contrary natures. And most importantly, the twin serpents were often depicted wearing the so-called white and red crowns of Egypt. The white crown was worn by the king of Upper Egypt. The red crown was worn by the king of Lower Egypt. Now, to understand the duality here, we really need to understand something about the history and geography of Egypt. Probably the most amazing thing about Egypt is that the entire empire formed a magical balance of opposites. And this truth is hidden in the actual flow of the river Nile. From time immemorial, the Nile has divided Egypt into a duality of two lands. The actual Nile has divided Egypt into two lands, so-called Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. From Upper Egypt in the country's south, that's the lower part, from Upper Egypt in the country's south, the Nile flows downstream towards the Mediterranean Sea into Lower Egypt in the north. Now, Upper Egypt is called upper because the land is elevated and closer to the source of the Nile. It's the highlands. Lower Egypt refers to the marshy swamps very close to the Mediterranean Sea. That's where the Nile actually flows into the Mediterranean. And the renowned author, J.E. Manship, wrote about this. Excuse me. He says, Egypt is the river Nile. On each side runs a narrow carpet of soil which supports a teeming population. Lower Egypt is short and broad. Upper Egypt is long and narrow. The two divisions, or two lands, as ancient Egyptians called them, are complementary. The Egyptians referred to Upper and Lower Egypt as the two lands, and what they called it was Tawi. And Upper Egypt was symbolized by the lotus plant, and Lower Egypt was symbolized by the papyrus plant. Now, during the pre-dynastic period, before Egyptian history officially began, the two lands were politically at odds. The country was divided into two separated kingdoms. Again, Upper Egypt in the south, Lower Egypt in the north. The kings of Lower Egypt wore the so-called red crown. The kings of Upper Egypt wore the so-called white crown. Now, according to Egyptologists, there was a constant rivalry. There was a lot of fighting, a lot of political problems between the two kingdoms. And here, if you could see it, there's a doctrine of duality here. There's this kind of yin and yang kind of going at each other. And we call that yin and yang, and the Freemasons call that Jachin and Boaz, as we talked about yesterday. All that we're really missing from this two kingdoms dichotomy is a third power, a reconciling power. Remember, the middle door. Where's the middle door of the triptych? We're just seeing the two outer doors. Where's the middle? So around 3100 BC, King Narmer, who was supposedly the first king of dynastic Egypt, united the two lands. This is considered the single most important event in Egyptian history. It laid the foundation for an era that we call dynastic Egypt, which is the Egyptian history that essentially scholars study, Egyptologists study. So together, all the dynasties compose this dynastic Egypt. Professor R.T. Rundle Clark, who lectured at Birmingham University, said Egypt was a union of two distinct regions, the Delta in the north and the Nile Valley in the south, and the king was the reconciler of the two, the reconciler of the duality, the reconciler of the opposites. And that's a key here. Writing in the 1940s, Henri Frankfurt, who was a professor of pre-classical antiquity at the University of London, explained this concept of the unification of the two lands in a very important way. He said, expressed in political form, the deeply rooted Egyptian tendency to understand the world as a series of pairs of contrast balanced in unchanging equilibrium. When Pharaoh assumed dualistic titles or called himself Lord of the Two Lands, he emphasized not the divided origin, but the universality of his power. The dualistic forms of Egyptian kingship embody the peculiarly Egyptian thought that a totality comprises opposites. The only place where he was wrong, in my opinion, is when he says the peculiarly Egyptian thought, because we find it in every ancient civilization. Just as I spoke about yesterday, the yin-yang, the concept of the circle being the uniter of the yin and the yang. The circle is the third power. And here the Egyptian pharaoh is the third power, holding both lands under his control. He's the lord of the two lands. It's very clear then that we can see here a very similar religion to ancient China. We see twin serpents adorning the Otton, wearing the white and red crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt. It's clearly the same thing. It perfectly parallels the ancient Chinese Taijitu symbol showing the yin and the yang. The serpent of Upper Egypt wearing the white crown parallels yang. The serpent of Lower Egypt wearing the red crown parallels yin. And just as yin and yang are encompassed by that circle, the sun disk or the circular Otton balances the two lands. And so this is an extremely parallel religion. And this is a very important parallel and similarity that I've never seen in any kind of official books, scholarly books, texts, and that type of thing. Thus, we're speaking of metaphysical history when we're seeing these symbols, we're seeing symbols of ourselves, of who we are. And if you look at the actual yin-yang symbol, it almost looks like two serpents fighting each other. One with a white eye with a black body and one with a black eye with a white body. And there's a parallel there as well. So duality exists inside the circle. The circle is the soul. So duality exists inside the soul. So you're not some helpless little puppet, as Alan Watts would say, being kicked around by omniscience. You are omniscience. And you have within you those twin puppets, okay? So that's the main teaching here. And this is what the immortal Persian poet and astronomer Omar Khayyam meant when he said, I sent my soul through the invisible, some letter of that afterlife to spell, and by my soul returned to me and answered, I myself am heaven and hell. And that's a powerful phrase, and I love that phrase because I think it matches everything that I've researched in my life so far. So when you awaken your third eye, remember we talked about the third eye of the Freemasons yesterday, then the middle eye, the eye that sees within. When you awaken your third eye, you recognize these metaphysical truths. And you begin to see that ancient cultures all around the world, like the Egyptians, based their entire civilization around these ideas. Now, when I was researching the third eye, I started to notice something strange in a lot of the third eye imagery that I saw from Egypt. I started to notice that when the Egyptians would depict their third eye with, two eyes and the sun disk as the third eye in the middle, remember from yesterday it was the Hindu bindi dot, the third eye chakra in the middle, the solar symbol in the middle. I noticed that they always put the same god under it, the same deity, standing in the same sitting or kneeling posture. Here's another image, very similar to that one. Now look closely at this posture, at this deity. Two eyes flank the Otton, which is in the position of the third eye, and directly beneath the Otton we see a goddess with outstretched arms, holding the twin Ankh crosses symmetrically in each hand. I deleted the wings here so you could see the outstretched arms. The Ankh cross symbolizes eternal life, or rather the spiritual life of the soul. And the third eye also symbolizes that kind of inner you, that higher self you, that spiritual, eternal third eye you. This same deity is visible in many of Egypt's third eye depictions. The more I looked, the more I found it. And I have literally hundreds of photographs that I could be plugging up here. But sometimes less is more, so I just want to keep your eyes focused on these. I soon learned that this image of this deity holding twin objects in each hand actually has a name. The Egyptians knew about this deity. It has a name. It's called He, okay, H-E-H. It's called He. And Egyptologists have deciphered its meaning. You know what it means? Lord of Eternity. Isn't that special? Lord of Eternity. That's what He means. The hieroglyph He means eternity. It's a perfect fit, I thought. A perfect fit. No wonder it's always depicted with those images of the third eye. No wonder, it's perfect. When you awaken your third eye, you see the eternal within. So the Egyptologist E.A. Wallace Budge, more than 100 years ago, recognized this, saying that the god He stood for eternity, the eternal, endless or limitless eternity, forever and ever. He was often depicted as a deity holding twin palm branches, those are palm branches, in his hand. And so the god was often considered as androgynous, and that's another important thing. Look at both the long hair and the beard. Have you ever wondered why a lot of Egyptian pharaohs kind of have that long hair and beard? And I believe that the reason is because what they're doing is they're combining the genders. Usually we'd think of long hair associated with women, and usually we think of a beard associated with men. When you combine the two, you're creating a sort of an androgen, and that symbol has reached us in the occult and the Hermetic wisdom as being a symbol of the kind of center point between the opposites. Not male, not female, androgynous, neutral. And it doesn't have anything to do with your sexual orientation. It just has to do with your spiritual orientation. Now note the Ankh cross looped around the arm. Again, the Ankh is the symbol of eternity. So we know that this posture is a very spiritual posture. It's imitating the eternity of life, of the eternal life of the soul. So images of He are abundant in Egypt, and they're often crowned with the Otton symbol, even if the two eyes aren't there. Here we can see that there were not just the same old He deity, but lots of Egyptian deities were depicted in this kind of, in this form where they're holding twin objects symmetrically. And here we have an example of an Egyptian god. His name is Bes, B-E-S. something cool is coming up right now, watch. This god's name is Bes. Now, when I started to look into this, I really was searching not just Egypt, I was looking at all of other cultures. And you know where I found something real parallel to this? Does anybody know what this is? Now, we're in the land of megaliths, right? And has anybody ever recognized the power of this symbol or linked this symbol to any of the megaliths? No. But it's in the land of the megaliths. Why? I don't know, but it's just like that, you know? It's just like that. It's the exact same thing. This is the Longman of Wilmington, for those of you who don't know. And I spotted this many years ago, and it really pushed me forward to try to search for this Egyptian icon in other parts of the world. This is a colossal hill figure said to be one of England's most enduring mysteries. It measures a colossal 227 feet from top to bottom, and he's described as Europe's largest representation of the human form. The giant holds what appear to be two staves symmetrically in each hand, and he looks just like the god Hay from Egypt. And I started to realize that as I started to look around the world, I started to see this image more and more, and not just in one culture, but in all the cultures. And what I started to realize was there were a certain group of cultures that really always depicted it in their art and architecture. Those were the pyramid cultures. And those were the pyramid cultures that built Triptych temples. So I really was turned on at this point because I knew I wasn't just seeing things, they're there. And it's just a matter of recognizing. And if you look at each culture also, there are important symbols in each culture. We'll see that now. I started to realize that in addition to the triptych, this other symbol that I would start to call the GodSelf icon also symbolized this kind of balance of opposites, and I'll explain that now. Here's another image of the GodSelf icon from all around the world, from cultures all around the world, including, but not limited to, Sumer, Bolivia, Nigeria, India, Greece, Persia, Indonesia, and so on. As I continued my research, I realized, as I said, the things in the hands are usually opposing each other. They stand for opposing principles, or the coincidentia oppositorum. Now, the GodSelf icon had supreme importance in some cultures, very obviously supreme importance in some cultures. And one of those cultures is actually not a culture, but a country now, it's Peru. Everywhere you go in Peru, you see the GodSelf icon, what I call the GodSelf icon. Andean archaeologists have noticed this. They've noticed that in Peru only, they've said, this symbol, this guy holding the twin staffs in each hand, they call it the staff god. And they say that this is the most important symbol probably in all of Peru. That's pretty big stuff, you know. What they haven't realized, though, is that the very same symbol that they call the staff god was widespread in the so-called Old World also, and on the other side of the planet. These images that you see here are from the Old World culture called Giroft, which was a small civilization in ancient Persia. It's dated to the late 3rd millennium BC. And they look very much like the staff god symbols of the Andes. And there's a very clear parallel there, facing forward, twin symmetrical objects held in each hand outward from the body, okay? So in my book, The Missing Link, I set forth the idea that the GodSelf icon, like the Triptych Temple, could possibly be evidence of a connection between the two sides of the Atlantic Ocean, and possibly evidence of a mother culture, the way the Victorian-era archaeologists believed in the possibility of a mother culture. I think this is strong evidence to their favor. So we get a sense of this possibility when looking at these GodSelf icons right here, which I'm about to show. This is the book that I actually published on the concept strictly of the GodSelf icon. It's called The Missing Link. It's an ebook. It's not available here. So look here. This, to me, is probably the most powerful evidence that I've found so far of a connection. The image on the left is from Bolivia, which is close to Peru. The image on the right is from Egypt. Now, the similarity here is really striking. The overall shape is a perfect match, and the details are amazing. Note the parallel hands, elbows, squat body, elongated staffs, and notice how they're held symmetrically. Here's a closer look. On the right, Egypt's master masons created this GodSelf. It's called Bes, as we described earlier. In the image on the left is from Tiahuanaco, a place called Tiahuanaco in Bolivia, and it's the so-called Viracocha deity created by master masons in the Andes. Now, this image, these images show the possibility that the twin civilizations here, the two civilizations here, were working off the same blueprint. The visual parallel is honestly just the tip of the iceberg, because scholars tell us that the Egyptians and the ancient Andean cultures actually followed the same balance of opposites religion. And we can see that here. On the left, we have two GodSelf icons from Peru. On the right, we have two GodSelf icons from Egypt. Note how the two GodSelf icons on the bottom are holding a single serpent in each hand, while the two GodSelf icons on the top are holding two serpents in each hand. So there's an added detail to the parallel here. On the left side is Peru. We're told by scholars in the quote here, Andean sensibility stresses the synthetic joining or fusion of complementary or opposing entities, sometimes around a central point or entity. This matches exactly what we read on the right side, and we see in Egypt, the phenomenon of duality pervades Egyptian culture and is at the heart of the Egyptian concept of the universe itself. But rather than focusing on the essential differences between the two parts of a given pair, Egyptian thought may stress their complementary nature as a way of expressing the essential unity of existence through the alignment and harmonization of opposites. So, by extending both hands outward from the body, the GodSelf icon is standing in between the duality. He's balancing the duality. Now, after noticing the GodSelf icon among ancient cultures, I started to look for it in Gothic cathedrals, and I found it plenty. And that, to me, is very interesting, because yesterday we talked about how the Freemasons created the Triptych Temple from ancient civilizations, how it was inherited from ancient civilizations. Seeing the GodSelf icon here in the Gothic cathedrals means it's another added symbol that's also inherited from ancient civilizations, and not just one ancient civilization, but multiple ancient cultures. To me, this marked evidence that the Freemasons really did inherit ancient wisdom from the past. And to me, this was kind of a reason to continue my research. The idea was to memorialize, again, what I called the ancient universal religion, the universal religion of the Triptych Temple. So I even noticed strange twists on the GodSelf icon, like this twin-tailed siren symbol, which we find in multiple ancient depictions of cathedrals. It's the same 3 in 1. The yins and yangs of the world we live in are symbolized by the 2 legs. And the siren herself embodies the eternal soul within. And variations of the GodSelf icon also exist. We can see that in this Gnostic symbol of Abraxas, with twin serpent legs facing the sun and moon. And we see that on the right and the left. Again, we talked about yesterday, the right being the solar, the left being the lunar. Notice the twin serpents parallel to Egypt, the Otton symbol, facing opposite directions. Another famous twist on the GodSelf icon is a figure known as the Androgen, which we talked about earlier. This figure mysteriously appeared in an array of medieval alchemical manuscripts. It shows a being with 2 heads, one male, one female, holding in its outstretched arms a sun and a moon, the sun in the male right hand, a moon in the female left hand. This balance of opposites shows that the center is the most, it's almost a triptych. You could see the triptych. The body in the middle is the center door, and the twin opposites are the male and female. A Masonic version of this androgen is called the Rebus. The Rebus, his right hand is linked to the sun, and the left hand is linked to the moon. The Rebus additionally holds a compass a Masonic compass tool in the right hand, which is solar, and balanced by a square tool, a Masonic square tool in the left hand. Now focus on those for a second. The compass and square are the chief symbols of Freemasonry. And here's a quote from Ohio State University scholar Hugh Urban. He says, he described the rebus as the mystery of the balance or coincidence of opposites. This is the secret of universal equilibrium between good and evil, light and darkness. Male and female, sun and moon, light and dark, symbolized by the Masonic compass and square, all come from the same source. So going back, we see that these ancient symbols, these ancient symbols from different parts of the world, which stand for the balance of opposites, this coincidentio oppositorum, same thing as the triptych. We see them in Gothic architecture built by the Freemasons, and we see that is known in the symbol of the rebus, and we're even told by scholars that it symbolizes the balance of opposites. That's pretty big stuff, I think. I think it's very important. And it surprised me that, and the reason I wrote books on it is because nobody else has talked about this. This is not talked about by anyone. No one's found this. No one's seen this. And to me, it's very obvious and meaningful. So the rebus is depicted standing atop a dragon as if conquering the wild beast. Here the dragon symbolizes our ego, our lower base desires and appetites. Legend says that the rebus was the first human being, perfect and divine. Unlike us, the rebus was fully conscious of its own divine nature. The rebus knew its inner divinity and that it was different. The rebus knew that its inner divinity was different from its outer human shell. This gnosis made the rebus godlike. But then something happened and the rebus fell into becoming who we are today. To explain this fall, the ancient Gnostics, who were the forerunners of the Freemasons, told the story in which God created the rebus but became jealous that the rebus was like him, knowing his eternal godhood. For this reason, God divided the rebus into two sexes, two independent beings weaker than the original and imperfect. One sex became predominantly male, with emphasis on solar qualities like day, light, hot, fire, and dry. The other sex became predominantly female, with emphasis on feminine qualities or lunar qualities like night, dark, cold, water, and wet. However, buried in their unconscious memory was a sense of their true essence and lost perfection, a vague memory of a past splendor when they were the rebus. It's for this reason that humans are attracted by love and marriage, always seeking to return to their primordial state of unity, divinity, and perfection. That's how the story goes anyway. The rebus lives at the center of every one of us. That's what the myth is trying to say, the story is trying to say. The rebus lives at the center of everyone. It's our GodSelf. Again, center door of the triptych, balancing the sun and moon, balancing the square and compass. It's your divine spark. Like the Triptych Temple, this is one of the secrets of Freemasonry. As the primordial human, the rebus is neither male nor female. And we see this again, holding the square and compass. Let's talk about that for a second. By holding them in each hand, it's balancing them, as all opposites were balanced in the beginning. And here's something that I found even more interesting. It's not just these Masonic symbols encoded in architecture or encoded here as symbolism of Freemasonry. We also see it in alchemical manuscripts. This is a manuscript dated to the 1600s. It's the GodSelf icon, again, holding twin objects symmetrically, each hand, sun associated with the right, moon with the left. Here's an alchemical manuscript. It's the golden tripod, Michael Mayer, 1618, the god Mercury. He's holding a pair of caduceus symbols, a sun beneath one, a moon beneath the other. He's in the GodSelf icon pose. So this image here is from the 16th century alchemical book called The Rosary of the Philosophers, GodSelf icon in the form of a woman, actually. Same thing, sun, moon, right, left. And this esoteric design has an unknown origin. It seems to be saying the same thing. The inner king, the inner divine, the master, is found when the opposites are in balance. And here's another king or master. I apologize for the watermark. I couldn't actually find the photos without the watermark. The king or master, this is from Azoth, from the series Basil Valentine, 1613. Again, sun in the right hand, moon in the left. So the rebus is your God self. It existed in the beginning when all dualities in creation were balanced, still united, before the separation, before what some people might call the fall. And so in order for a human being to return to that source, to return to that pristine state, they have to balance the opposites or bring together the opposites in a kind of willful alchemy. And we do that by unifying the two. So notice how the compass and square are kind of separated from each other. They're pulled apart together. Now, that's not the usual case. Usually what we see is the square and compass together, as we do in Freemasonry, and we see that right here. Here they're pulled apart. Here they're together. Now, most Masons just don't know what this symbol means. Most people don't know what this symbol means. This is the Masonic square and compass symbol. The letter G has to do with geometry or God or gnosis, depending on who you ask. For me, I've always been fascinated by this symbol because I've always felt like I understood what it means. The higher self and the lower self, the spiritual self and the bodily or creature animal self. The higher self is symbolized by the compass on top. The lower self is symbolized by the square on the bottom. The compass and square symbolize, they're symbols of the makeup of every human being. The compass is a symbol of the soul, the square is a symbol of the body, and when they're placed together, they're actually a symbol of the body and the soul together, as we are when we're human beings. So if you look at the square, it's actually lower than the compass. The compass is higher, the square is lower. And that's because, according to this ancient thought, this esoteric thought, the soul is higher than the actual body. The body is lower because the body is an animal that lives and dies on earth, and it has an ego, and it has different kind of appetites and desires and that type of thing. Whereas the soul is pure, it's perfect, it's eternal, it's deity. So here, that's the reason why the compass is higher and the square is lower. There's another reason, too, because the square forms a square figure. And the number 4 is important because when the soul manifests into the world, it manifests into a world that's 4-sided. And we see that in the 4 cardinal points of the compass, in the 4 seasons, in the 4 elements, and in the 4 states of matter. The operative Freemasons have esoterically encoded the imagery of the square and the circle, or the compass and the square, by creating it, by encoding it into different types of architecture. Now, in the Masonic square and compass symbol, the compass is, we talked about that, sorry. Okay, so let's see. In his 1922 book, this is all supported by author Demon Wagstaff. He said, there's one sign which has never changed its meaning in the civilized world, the compass and the square, a union of the body and the soul. I didn't find a lot of quotes about that. That's one that I did find that kind of backs up what I'm talking about, and that's why I included it. So it means essentially that, according to some of the ancient philosophers, our soul has descended so far into the material world that from our higher heavenly home, that we've forgotten our true selves. We have amnesia of who we really are. And these teachings are very important because as man, we've lost sight of the soul within, and that's the God within, the center point of the triptych, which is who we really are. We know we have a body, we know we have a square part. We see that in the mirror every day, but it's a little bit more difficult to see the spiritual part, the compass part, the circle part, because that's something that we can't really see or taste or touch. It's the higher soul, the God within us. To me, this is done through a kind of inner alchemy, and that's a whole different lecture. A lot of you have come up and asked me, how do you balance the opposites? And there's a lot of self-help books. There's a lot of books that talk about awakening the third eye, finding the soul within, balancing the opposites. This is really just about showing the archaeology of it, showing how it's not just an ancient Hindu teaching. You find it in China, you find it in Egypt, you find it in the Americas as well. So let's conclude today with an example of how you can do this, just in a kind of psychological way. And the way this is done, Hindus tell us, is just to think that everything is always changing. Everything is always kind of going back and forth from yin to yang to yin again. And in Freemasonry, this concept is symbolized by the checkerboard floor, the black and white checkerboard floor of Gothic cathedrals, castles, and other medieval architecture. Life is always changing from good to evil, evil to good, right to wrong, etc., back and forth. But the trick is to remember that what the Greek philosophers taught was that we're living in Plato's cave. The reality that we see is not really reality. It's a shadow of the reality. And as an example of this, we can look out into the world and we see that, for example, continents, they are not really always continents. They change their shapes. They shift. Rivers dry up and other rivers begin. The lives of plants and animals and humans are especially fleeting, they're temporary. Even in space, as we all know, stars, planets, and galaxies spin into and out of existence. Everything has a temporary stability, and so it appears like it's reality. But eventually, everything changes. And so for the ancient Hindus and other cultures, this meant that everything is not really real, okay? Yin passes into yang, and yang passes into yin. And so this constant change meant for the ancients that life is more like a dream. And this I found everywhere in all cultures. They talked about this. And we have a memory of this concept here. The 13th century Persian poet Rumi said, this place is a dream. Only a sleeper considers it real. Then death comes like dawn, and you wake up laughing at what you thought was your grief. The 17th century poet and writer Pedro Calderón said, what is life? An illusion, a shadow, a story. All life is a dream. And René Descartes famously said, how can you be certain that your whole life is not a dream? And we find this in nursery rhymes too. Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream, merrily, 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 life is just a dream. Life is but a dream. And the immortal Shakespeare, we are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. So over the years, I've come to believe these life is a dream statements have profound significance. I think they're related to the GodSelf icon. I think they're related to the Triptych as well. And the Triptych and the GodSelf icon have taught me that, that there's a deity inside, and that the Christian religion has kind of pulled it out and thrown it over there and said, follow that guy. But really, it's inside you. It's inside every one of you. And all the architecture that you see, and all the myths that you hear, and all the religions all teach what's inside you. And we're at Megalithomania, and all the megaliths that we see, and all of that doesn't have to do with anything out there. It has to do with you, and it's touching you, and it's up to you to make that connection. Because obviously scholars aren't making that connection for us. So the Triptych and the GodSelf icon, I hope to do more research on them in the years to come and hope to expand on the existing research. And I just want to take a second and say thank you to you all for listening to my lecture, and thank you to Hugh and the organizers of the conference for inviting me. Had a great time, and they've done a splendid job. Thanks, everybody. I really appreciate it.